High on a bare Ural slope, searchers found a canvas tent half buried in snow, its sides sliced open from the inside. Downhill, a line of footprints ran away into the dark, some pressed by a bare foot, some by a single sock, in a cold that can kill a healthy person in under an hour. The tent was still standing. Inside it, everything was in order. Boots lined up, food laid out, a stove waiting to be hung, coats and blankets folded as if their owners meant to come back in a moment. Nobody had. Whatever happened on this mountain, it had not been slow and it had not been calm. 9 experienced skiers had torn their way out through the wall of their own shelter and walked, barefoot and half-dressed, straight into a winter night that offered them no mercy. This is a real case, with real names and real records. It has an investigation, autopsy reports, photographs the hikers themselves took, and a file the Soviet state kept closed for decades. It also has a hole in the middle of it that more than 60 years of study has not been able to fill. Records Untold does not deal in aliens or invented monsters. We deal in the documented, the evidenced, and the honestly unresolved. The Dyatlov Pass incident is all three. To understand the tent, you have to go back 3 weeks to a warm room full of young people who thought the hardest part of the trip would be the climb. They came from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk, students and recent graduates who spent their weekends in the mountains for the love of it. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23, a radio engineering student, calm and meticulous, the kind of man others trusted to plan a route and read the weather. The trip was his, a demanding winter ski trek through the northern Urals, rated at the highest category of difficulty the Soviet system recognized, with the peak called Otorten as the goal. There were 10 of them at the start. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, bright and well-liked, a strong skier. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, fierce and idealistic. Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, and Georgy Krivonishenko, whom everyone called Yuri, all in their early 20s, all seasoned on the trail. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, descended from a French family, quick with a joke. Alexander Kolovatov, careful and quiet. And the oldest by far, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a decorated veteran of the Second World War who had signed on as a guide, older than the students, but hungry for one more serious expedition. The 10th was Yuri Yudin. Days into the journey, an old joint ailment flared in the cold, and he made the hardest decision of the trip: to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends at an abandoned mining settlement, hugged them, took some gear to lighten their loads, and started home. That parting saved his life. Yuri Yudin would live for another 54 years, and for all of them, he would carry the question of what happened to the 9 he left behind. It matters to say clearly who these people were, because the strangeness of the case can make it easy to forget. They were not thrill-seekers courting death, and they were not novices wandering into danger they did not understand. Winter mountaineering at this level was a respected discipline in the Soviet Union, and the group had trained for it. They knew how to build a snow shelter, how to ration food and fuel, how to move as a team when the weather turned. If this trek killed them, it was not because they were careless. It was because something met them on that mountain that their training had not prepared them for. And that, more than any single injury, is what has kept people staring at this case for more than 60 years. Know a great deal about their final days because they documented them. The group kept diaries and they carried cameras, and both the diaries and the film survived. In the photographs, the hikers are laughing, breaking trail through deep snow, hauling heavy packs, mugging for the lens in the cold. There is nothing ominous in them. They are simply young people on a hard, happy adventure, doing something difficult because it was worth doing. The diaries are just as ordinary, and that ordinariness is part of what makes the ending so hard to accept. They wrote about the weather, about sore shoulders and frozen fingers, about food and songs and small quarrels. They kept a joking group newsletter. They noted the deep snow and the wind. Nowhere in those pages is there fear of anything but the usual hardships of a winter trek. No sense of being followed, no premonition, nothing to hint that this trip would end differently from a dozen others they had survived. The last frames on their cameras are debated to this day. One is little more than a blur of light, and people have read everything and nothing into it. Most likely, it is simply a wasted exposure, the accidental last click of a camera that would never be used again. On the 1st of February 1959, they climbed toward a pass between two peaks. One of those peaks carried an old name from the Mansi, the indigenous people of the region, Kholat Syakhl, which is usually translated as Dead Mountain. The name refers to the bareness of the slope, where little grows, but in hindsight, it reads like a warning nobody could have heeded. Late in the day, weather closing in and visibility poor, Dyatlov made a choice that investigators would argue over for generations. Instead of dropping down into the shelter of the tree line for the night, the group pitched their tent on the open, snow-loaded flank of the mountain, exposed to the wind. It may have been a decision to avoid losing hard-won altitude. It may have been simple misjudgment in bad light. Their last known photographs show them digging the tent into the slope as evening came on. Then the record goes dark, and everything we know after that comes not from them, but from what the snow gave back. The hikers did not return on schedule, and no telegram came. Worry turned into a search. Family members pressed the institute. Volunteers, students, soldiers, and local hunters were mobilized. The 26th of February, searchers reached the slope of Kholat Syakhl and found the tent, collapsed, snowed over, and cut open from the inside. That last detail is one of the hardest facts of the whole case, and it is not in dispute. Investigators examined the canvas and concluded the slashes had been made by a knife wielded from within. The 9 had not been dragged out. They had cut their own way out and run. Their tracks told the rest. 8 or 9 sets of footprints led down the slope toward the forest, roughly a mile away. The prints showed no sign of panic scattering in different directions. The group moved together downhill, and this is the detail that haunts everyone who studies the case. Many of them were barefoot or wearing only socks in temperatures that likely sat around 25 degrees below zero in wind. No one dresses like that on purpose in such cold. They left the tent so fast or in such a state that boots and coats were a luxury they abandoned. At the tree line stood a tall cedar. Beneath it, searchers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, stripped down to their underclothes near the remains of a small fire. Branches on the cedar were broken as high as 15 feet up, as if someone had climbed it, perhaps for a vantage point, perhaps for wood, perhaps to see the tent. The fire had burned, but not long enough and not hot enough to save anyone. Between the cedar and the tent in the open, 3 more were found: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They lay at intervals along the line back toward the shelter, faces uphill, as though they had died trying to return, to bring back the tent, the clothing, the means to survive. They had come so close to living, and still, 4 of their friends were nowhere to be found. Piece the scene together and a story begins to form, one investigators have retraced many times. The group fled the tent together, downhill, toward the only cover in sight. At the cedar, they tried to make a stand against the cold. They lit a fire. They climbed for wood or for a look back at the tent. They stripped the dead of what warmth they could use. Then some of them, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, the strongest still standing, turned and started back up the slope toward the shelter, into the wind, and died one by one along the way. It is a picture of people fighting, methodically and bravely, against something that had already beaten them. What it does not explain on its own is why they left the tent in the first place. The last 4 stayed missing through the winter. It was not until May, when the snow began to melt, that searchers found them in a ravine deeper in the forest, buried under many feet of snow, in what looked like a hollowed-out den beside a stream. They were Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov. Unlike the others, several of them were better clothed, wearing garments that had belonged to friends already dead. A grim, rational sign that the living had taken warmth from the fallen, trying to survive. But their injuries are where the case turns from tragic to genuinely strange. The first 5 had died, by all medical accounts, of hypothermia, freezing, the ordinary killer of the mountains. The last 4 had died of something more violent. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had a major fracture of the skull. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had massive chest injuries, crushed ribs, the kind of trauma one investigator compared to the force of a car crash. And yet, in most cases, there were no matching wounds on the outside, no broken skin over the broken bones. Whatever crushed them had done so through a cushion without cutting them open. Then there were the details that fed decades of speculation. Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips. Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. To some, this sounded like mutilation. To forensic pathologists, it pointed to something bleaker and more natural. A body lying face down in running meltwater for weeks, with soft tissues, the first to go to water and to scavengers. Some of the recovered clothing carried traces of radiation, which investigators noted but never fully explained. One of the hikers had worked with radioactive materials, a possible ordinary source. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, closed the case in the spring of 1959. His official conclusion was maddening in its vagueness. The hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force that they had been unable to overcome. The file was classified. The relatives were told little. And for years in the Soviet Union, it was simply not a thing one discussed. So what could make 9 level-headed, experienced people cut their way out of a warm tent and run barefoot into a killing cold? Over 60 years, serious people have offered serious answers, and the honest truth is that several of them are plausible, and none of them is proven beyond doubt. The leading explanation today is a snow slab avalanche. For years, this was dismissed. The slope seemed too gentle, and there was no obvious avalanche debris. But in 2019 and 2020, Russian prosecutors reopened the case and concluded that an avalanche, combined with terrible visibility, best fit the evidence. Then in 2021, 2 scientists in Switzerland, Alexander Puzrin and Johann Gaume, published a study in a peer-reviewed journal modeling exactly how a small, delayed slab of snow could have released above a tent cut into that slope. Such a slab, they argued, could strike sleeping people with enough force to crush ribs and fracture a skull through the cushion of bedding without leaving external wounds, matching the injuries precisely. A slab would explain the flight to the trees, the desperate attempts to return, and the freezing that followed. Later expeditions confirmed the area is more avalanche-prone than anyone once believed. But the avalanche theory has honest critics, and other explanations remain on the table. Some point to katabatic winds, sudden, violent downslope gusts that can hit like a wall and make a tent uninhabitable in seconds. One widely discussed idea holds that the shape of the mountain could have generated infrasound, a low-frequency sound below human hearing that, in some accounts, produces dread and panic, a possible reason to flee in terror. Others note the region's history of secret military testing and the radiation traces, and wonder about weapons trials the state would never have admitted. And the strangest details have gentler explanations than they first appear. The removed clothing fits a known effect of severe hypothermia called paradoxical undressing, in which the freezing sometimes tear off their own clothes, feeling a false fatal heat. Weigh it honestly, and the picture that holds together best is a chain of ordinary catastrophes: a slab of snow, a panicked evacuation into the dark, a fire that was not enough, and the cold finishing what the mountain started. It is not aliens. It is not a monster. It is 9 friends good at what they did, undone in a single night by forces bigger than their skill. And still, the exact sequence, the precise trigger, the reason for every wound remains beyond certain reach. The Soviet investigators' phrase was evasive, but it may also have been the most honest thing in the file. A compelling natural force which they could not overcome. That is where the case rests, not solved to the last detail, but grounded. No fantasy required to feel its weight. What remains is the image the searchers found first. A tent standing empty on a bare white slope, its wall open from the inside, and a line of barefoot prints running downhill into the dark, away from the only warmth for miles. 9 people made those prints. Every one of them was trying to live. And the mountain the Mansi called dead kept the rest of the answer for itself. So, how do the pieces actually fit? It is not aliens. It is not a monster. It is 9 friends good at what they did, undone in a single night by forces bigger than their skill. But here is what 60 years cannot pin down: the exact sequence, the precise trigger, the reason for every wound. It remains beyond certain reach. The Soviet investigators' phrase was evasive, but it may also have been the most honest thing in the file: a compelling natural force which they could not overcome. That is where the case rests, not solved to the last detail, but grounded. No fantasy required to feel its weight. Here is what remains: the image the searchers found first, a tent standing empty on a bare white slope, its wall opened from the inside, and a line of barefoot prints running downhill into the dark, away from the only warmth for miles. 9 people made those prints. Every one of them was trying to live, but why they ran, the mountain the Mansi called dead never gave back.